Today is Sunday, 13th October, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is commemorations in Israel ended, and presumably that clears the way for an Israeli missile strike. At least there doesn't seem to be any reason connected with that Jewish commemoration day or holiday to hold back from an attack on Iran, if that is indeed, for the moment, if that is indeed what the Israeli government is considering or planning to do. Well, there's been no word of that for the moment. On the contrary, I've been looking at the Israeli media this morning, and they're talking about more pressure from the United States, supposedly, for Israel to resume the diplomatic course. But they're also giving a lot of coverage to reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now demanding that UN peacekeepers stand aside in southern Lebanon. He claims that the Hezbollah forces are using them as shields. He says that they should get out of the way, all of which suggests that, on the contrary, an escalation by Israel of its ground operation in South Lebanon is being prepared. Now, whether the UN forces will indeed withdraw remains to be seen. Presumably, various parties within the UN system will have their own things to say about that. If they do withdraw, it will be, if I may say so, a blow for the credibility of the UN, in the sense that one assumes that peacekeepers are present to maintain peace, and clearly there's fighting going on, intense and bloody fighting going on in southern Lebanon. So the peacekeepers are failing in that function. And of course, if they are ordered by the Prime Minister of Israel to withdraw, and they do withdraw, then many will say around the world, well, what kind of UN peacekeepers are these? They don't take their instructions from the UN Secretariat in New York. They take their instructions from the government of Israel. Just saying. It should be said that my understanding of the presence of this UN peacekeeping force is that it was brought into the area following the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. And there was some discussion at that time, some acceptance, some agreement at that time, that some kind of buffer zone would be created, and that the Lebanese army would move into the area, and that the peacekeeping forces, the UN peacekeeping forces, would support it. That never quite happened. Hezbollah maintained its positions in southern Lebanon, and of course the Israelis also continued to be active in the territory along the border. There's never been a fully peaceful border between Israel and Lebanon. There's always been tension and fighting, even if sometimes at a very low level along this borderline. And one could argue, I suppose, that the UN force has never, in that respect, properly fulfilled its function and has never operated in the kind of conditions where it was presumably initially intended that it would operate. But having said all of that, to repeat again, if it now scuttles away because the Prime Minister of Israel tells it to go, it will further damage the credibility of the UN and of the UN Secretariat and of its peacekeeping missions in the region. I am not saying completely beyond repair, but certainly to a very great extent, and that might make any further negotiation for a ceasefire in Lebanon, which could result in the deployment of a peacekeeping force, even more difficult. Anyway, lots of reports to that effect about Prime Minister Netanyahu's warning. By the way, the fact that he's having to give this warning and that he's giving it now further confirms what I think most people are now gradually coming round to thinking, which is that the fighting in southern Lebanon is extremely difficult for the Israeli army, and that they're making slow progress and perhaps not making much progress. The fact that they're having to demand now, about a week after the incursion began, that they're demanding now that the UN peacekeeping forces withdraw, strongly suggests, at least to me, that the situation is not as Israel or the Israeli authorities or Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet anticipated, and that they're having to consider escalatory moves, and that the withdrawal of the UN peacekeepers, is necessary in order to implement those moves. Meanwhile, and for the record, Hezbollah continues its missile strikes into Israel. And for the further record, my sense is that with the fighting underway on the border, with Israel apparently making only slow progress, with Hezbollah obviously intact and still fighting, the morale of Hezbollah and of its fighters and of those communities in Lebanon which support Hezbollah, that their morale is rising and had already begun to rise, specifically after the Iranian missile attack on Israel, which took place around 2 weeks ago. Now, there are further reports in the Israeli media, including a rather concerning one from Haaretz. This report is drawn from, Haaretz says, serving people within the Israeli Defense Forces, in other words, the Israeli military. They're saying that the Israeli government, the Israeli authorities, have basically stopped all discussions and negotiations for the release of the remaining hostages, Israeli hostages, held by Hezbollah. Around 100 people, supposedly, though there are suggestions that up to 50 of them might by now be dead. Just saying. Anyway, apparently the Israeli authorities have abandoned all attempts to have these people released, and that they are instead giving serious thought to clearing northern Gaza of its Palestinian inhabitants, preparatory to outright annexation of this territory. Now, we've heard rumors about this before, that there's been discussions within Israel about annexing some or all of Gaza to Israel, and of making the Palestinians who live there leave. It hasn't happened up to now. This is a report in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, but Haaretz is, of course, deeply opposed to the Israeli government. It does have sources within the Israeli military. However, it may be that this report is true. Certainly, some Israeli political leaders and officials and government ministers have spoken in the past in ways that would be fully consistent with such a plan. Now, I'm going to say, if that does happen, then an enormous line will have been crossed. If Israel starts formally annexing territory which it initially captured during the 1967 Six-Day War, of course, it already claims East Jerusalem as part of its territory, but that everyone understands was something that Israel was certain to do after the Six-Day War. But if it now takes a further step of annexing Arab land, Palestinian land which it captured in 1967 in this sort of way, if more people are driven out of their homes in this territory and prevented from ever returning, then I'm going to say it's going to be a huge event, one which will have incalculable consequences in the Middle East, one which I am certain will harden opposition to Israel across the Middle East, across the Arab and Muslim worlds, and one which will make any further step towards negotiation in this region even more difficult than it already is. It is also going to be a step which Western governments are going to be deeply embarrassed by. Do they accept it? Do they go along with it? Do they wring their hands and say that it's got nothing to do with them and that Israel might have done this, but notwithstanding that, they won't recognize it, but that they do understand why it was done? Or do they, perhaps, in some cases, go all the way and straightforwardly support it? One way or the other, an event of this kind, if it happens, and if this is really the plan, is going to damage Western credibility further in the Middle East. It's going to make even conservative Arab governments wonder whether there is any point which hardliners, the most extreme hardliners in Israel take, where the Western powers, the United States first and foremost, finally say to Israel, enough, this is going too far, you must stop and go back. Anyway, we'll see. These are tumultuous times in the Middle East. We remain on the brink of a larger war. The Israelis have promised us an attack on Iran of some kind. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said that it would be powerful, precise, and above all, surprising. He made, by the way, claims in that statement that the Iranian strike had not been precise, when all the indications are that it was, just saying. But anyway, he has promised that the Israeli strike, the Israeli counterstrike on Iran will be powerful, precise, and above all, surprising. We'll see when it happens, if it happens, how precise and how surprising it actually turns out to be. And I'm going to say something, by the way, which is that Israel's own credibility now is on the line. As we saw in the weeks after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the Iranians promised that there would be a strike, a retaliatory strike on Israel. The weeks passed and turned into months, and no such strike took place, and Iran's credibility began to suffer, and we were receiving what I thought were fairly plausible, fairly convincing reports of dissension, of arguments between Iran and its Shia militia allies across the Middle East, with reports of difficult and stormy meetings in which Iranian officials pleaded with their allies, their Shia allies, to understand why they were not rushing to conduct that strike on Israel that they had said that they would. And some of these strains apparently affected the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. At least that was what some of the reports said. And certainly I've had eyewitness reports, including Iranian eyewitness reports, that there was a significant loss in credibility and face for Iran in the Shia areas of Lebanon because of the delay, Iran's delay in conducting its own strike against Israel. Well, a strike by Iran against Israel has taken place. It has been effective. I've discussed this in a series of programs. I refer to that article by the Daily Telegraph. Theodore Postol discussed all of this in an interview he gave to Daniel Davis, which you can find on YouTube at Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And now, the burden of credibility switches to Israel. If the weeks turn into months and there is no Israeli response, no Israeli strike against Iran, or if an Israeli strike on Iran does take place, but is widely assessed and believed to have been of only limited effect, then Israel's credibility will be damaged. People will start to say that it is Israel rather than Iran, which is the paper tiger that makes the threats which it is not really able to act upon. So whereas before the pressure was on the Iranians, now to some extent the pressure is on the Israelis. Now, if we go back to the various discussions that were taking place in the summer, there were all those reports of Russian military equipment and technicians arriving in Iran, talk of electronic warfare systems being supplied by Russia to Iran, talk of S-400 air defense missiles being supplied by Russia to Iran, lots of reports that the Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu was visiting Iran. There were lots of reports and discussions circulating about that. As I said in my program yesterday, articles that have appeared in the Iranian media critical of what they see as tepid support to Iran from Russia. And by the way, it's important to say that Iran does have its own media, and it is far from being monolithic. On the contrary, it is extremely, from what I can judge, extremely argumentative and often very critical of the Iranian authorities, though I would stress I'm talking about the domestic Iranian media, not the Iranian media published in English by the major Iranian news agencies and international broadcasting channels, which are the ones that most people outside Iran read. Anyway, critical articles had appeared within Iran criticizing Russia for its tepid response to the actions taken by Israel and complaining that Iran has not received S-400 missiles, which to my mind strongly suggests that those reports that were published in the summer, that S-400 missile deliveries had taken place and that the Russians had supplied these weapons to Iran, that those reports were untrue. Maybe, just possibly, the Russians have been supplying Iran with other systems, possibly older S-300 systems, still very potent air defense missile systems, not as advanced as the S-400s, and conceivably as S-400 production in Russia increases, and as the Russians phase S-300 systems out of service to replace them with S-400s. They're now supplying some of these older S-300 systems to Iran. That is a pure guess, by the way. I have absolutely no information to support it. But anyway, we had all of those reports in the summer. Now we're having reports that the Americans are doing the same that the Russians were supposed to have been doing to help the Iranians, that the Americans are now supporting Israel by supplying advanced surface-to-air missiles to Israel. And these missiles are apparently THAAD, THAAD, anti-ballistic missiles, developed by the United States. I believe they're some of the most advanced missiles that the United States possesses. Their primary location, to the best of my knowledge, is in East Asia, in South Korea, and in other places thereabouts. They were originally reported as having been developed in order to counter North Korean missiles. But obviously the United States has had the option to deploy these missiles in other places, and the reports say that they're now being sent to Israel. And if that is true, again, I would treat that as further proof that the Israeli and, by the way, American air defense systems that were located in Israel and which sought to counter the Iranian strike, but which were only partially successful, or perhaps more properly, were largely unsuccessful. That in the light of the success, the comparative success of the Iranian strike, the United States has decided that in order to counter more Iranian missile strikes of this sort, the most advanced air defense system of all, the THAAD, must be supplied to Israel. And that this is why these missiles are now being sent to Israel as well. Now, there are problems with this, which is that I understand that if Patriot missile systems are in limited supply, the THAADs are in even more short supply. This is a complicated, expensive, very sophisticated system indeed. And given that the Iranians were able to launch 180 ballistic missiles, advanced ballistic missiles, some of them, perhaps all of them, with a hypersonic capability in one barrage, and given that they're supposed to have another 3,000 such missiles available, and perhaps the number is even greater, as some people have pointed out, the figure of 3,000 ballistic missiles in Iran's arsenal is actually quite old. It dates from a few years back, and it's plausible that the Iranians have manufactured significantly more of these missiles since then. Well, anyway, the fact that the Iranians appear to have such large number of missiles must create a concern that the limited number of THAADs, even if they are effective in shooting down Iranian missiles, mean that if there is a prolonged missile war between Israel and Iran, the THAADs could be overwhelmed. The Iranians would simply be able to launch more missiles than the THAADs could shoot down, and that this is not really a long-term solution to Israel's air defense problems. Just saying. Anyway, one other fact to bear in mind about the possible, in fact, almost certain deployment of the THAAD missiles to Israel is that, apart from the fact that it highlights what appear to be problems with Israel's own air defense system, this famous Iron Dome and David's sling and all of those. Other than that, it makes it much less likely, perhaps impossible, for the United States to deploy THAAD missiles to Ukraine or to supply THAAD missiles to Ukraine. Now, I've been saying this. I should say that for some months now, I've been getting a drumbeat of reports that the ultimate plan that the United States and the Western powers have is to establish a defense line along the Dnieper River. There's been reports about the so-called Iron Triangle of cities, Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and others in the Dnieper area, where the major fortifications and defenses would be established, and where supposedly powerful air defenses would be established. And these air defenses would be made up, not entirely, but to a certain degree, of THAAD missiles. And I've been hearing lots of reports about fiber optic communications systems being established in this precise area in order to lay the groundwork for these fortifications. By the way, I want to stress, I think that these reports almost certainly have at least an element of truth about them. I believe that these plans do exist. I believe that some work almost certainly has been done to implement these plans. I am skeptical that these plans can go very far in conditions of war when the Russians have overwhelming air superiority, as they demonstrate over Ukraine every day. I doubt that it's been possible to develop these fortified lines to anything like the degree that the original plans anticipated. But certainly I think that there has been discussion in the West of a plan of this kind. There might, for all I know, have been some attempts to put it in place, but with competing demands now from Israel and from elsewhere in the Middle East for advanced air defense systems, given the limited number of THAADs and Patriots and all of those, I wonder whether this plan for fortified lines on the Dnieper can be taken much further, whether it can ever be brought to full effectiveness as its authors doubtless intended. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation at the moment in the Middle East. Just to finish, I think Zelensky himself and his officials, who cannot be oblivious to the situation in the Middle East, they must be looking on developments in the Middle East with deep concern, and they must be aware about the competing demands between their needs and those of Israel in terms of air defense systems and other weapon systems. And they must be saying to themselves that with this situation in the Middle East, any chance of Ukraine getting more weapon systems from the West, or to be more precise, from the United States, is now dwindling away. Which brings me further to the latest reports about President Zelensky's activities. In my latest program, I discussed how he'd met with Keir Starmer in London, and how Keir Starmer had basically told him that no weapon is a weapon that in and of itself and by itself can win a war, that the storm shadows, that Ukraine should not expect the storm shadows to suffice, by themselves to win the war for Ukraine. And the British, perhaps rather grudgingly, were telling the Ukrainians that, for the moment at least, they're not in a position to greenlight missile strikes deep inside Russia. The Americans remain opposed, and Britain simply can't go it alone on this one. So I said in my program yesterday that my impression was that when he goes around Europe, when he visits the leading European countries, the door is now being shut in his face. And well, he went on from Britain and he went to Germany and he had meetings there with Chancellor Olaf Scholz and with other officials. But according to BITCHUTE, that is exactly the same thing that happened in Germany as well. Germany, until very recently, was the biggest supplier of military equipment to Ukraine of all the European countries. Something which was not uncontroversial, by the way, in Germany itself. The Bundeswehr, the German military, is itself in far from good shape. It suffers from multiple equipment shortages. The problems that the Bundeswehr faces were in fact further highlighted by the demands from Ukraine. It turned out that there weren't that many Leopard 2 tanks, for example. There weren't that many available Leopard 2 tanks that Germany could supply to Ukraine. They had to scrounge around Europe to try and find more Leopard 2 tanks, with the result being that Ukraine received Leopard 2 tanks from various countries, these Leopard 2s all being of different levels of capabilities, far from being exactly the same, sometimes, as I understand it, not even fully interoperable with each other. But basically, the Germans were short of Leopard 2s, and it proved impractical, has proved impractical, to restart the production line. And Germany was short of armoured vehicles, and of course armoured vehicles had to be taken out of storage, and it turned out that the Marders, the previous generation of German infantry fighting vehicles, some of them were not in particularly good condition, and then the Germans decided to take out of storage the older Leopard 1 tanks designed in the 1950s and placed in production in the 1960s, which had been the mainstay of the Bundeswehr up till the 1980s, but a tank which most people today would accept has seen its best days. It's no longer perhaps fully viable on modern battlefields. Anyway, the Germans decided that since they couldn't supply Ukraine with Leopard 2s, they would instead supply Ukraine with Leopard 1s taken out of storage. And then, an even greater humiliation, it turned out that the Leopard 1s in storage were not in particularly good condition. There had to be massive work done to bring them back to some kind of serviceable state. This has been a protracted and very, very slow and complicated affair. And Ukraine has received some Leopard 1s, which have been used by the Ukrainians on the battlefields without any very significant results. By the way, in their reports, the Russians don't distinguish between the Leopard 2s and the Leopard 1s, even though they are completely different tanks, with the Leopard 2s far more effective and powerful than the Leopard 1s, which, by the way, makes it very difficult to gauge how effective or not the Leopard 1s have actually been. But anyway, the whole Leopard 1 saga was something of a humiliation and a shambles, and the attempt by Rheinmetall, in particular, German company, to step up production of artillery shells has proved to be something of a debacle as well. various reports that were circulating at the start of this year that production of shells by Rheinmetall had reached huge levels and was surpassing shell production in the United States, turned out to be, as I suspected at the time, completely wrong. It turned out that European production of shells was around 60 to 70% below target, with the bulk of it, or at least a large proportion of it, in Germany. So anyway, long and the short of it was, the German military and the German military-industrial complex turned out to be in even worse shape than had been known to be the case before the war started and before the deliveries of weapons were made to Ukraine. So anyway, here comes Zelensky, and he demands more, and apparently the Germans, this time, Chancellor Scholz, they didn't say yes, but they didn't say no. They said nothing. They ignored the request. Zelensky's pleas for more weapons were met with silence, and there have been reports, apparently, in the German media saying that Germany is basically tanked out. It's given all it can. It is simply not in a position to provide Ukraine with anything more, and that the days of large German arms deliveries to Ukraine are now past. According to BITCHUTE, it was the same with Zelensky's pleas for accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO. Chancellor Scholz and his officials listened to those pleas, and then they pretended that nothing had been said. They didn't say yes, and they didn't say no. They didn't say anything, but reports have circulated in Germany, apparently, that Zelensky's pleas for accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO in Germany are simply not being taken seriously. So the Germans, well, perhaps they will be able to provide some more air defense missiles. Apparently, production of IRIS-Ts is also very slow, but some new ones are being produced. It may be that some of these will be sent to Ukraine over the next few weeks or months. It seems that a decision to supply Ukraine with more Patriot missiles has essentially been dropped. The idea that Germany apparently had to engage in joint production of Patriot missile interceptors with Japan, that's fallen far behind schedule and hasn't produced any missiles. So no missiles from that source either. So the Americans were having problems supplying weapons. The Pentagon worried about the depletion of its own arsenals, apparently saying that more weapons cannot be provided by the United States. The Pentagon now also having to think about arms supplies, arms deliveries to Israel, and the Europeans basically saying they simply can't do any more. They've done all that they can, and apparently they're telling Zelensky in private, well, we've done all we can, we can't do more. Maybe it's time for you to sit down and talk, or at least to offer some concessions, to come up with some kind of proposal that might just possibly bring us closer to that point when the war ends. Anyway, that's apparently the message that Zelensky has been receiving. He's, even before the present crisis ignited in the Middle East with the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah and the Israeli military operation in southern Lebanon and the Iranian missile strike, it was becoming increasingly clear that the United States was running out of its ability to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons and indeed funding. Speaker Johnson has said that he's tired of Ukrainian funding requests. And the Europeans, the Germans, the British, one must assume the French, the Italians and the Spanish as well, are coming and saying, well, realistically, practically, there isn't very much more. There isn't anything more that we can do. The only weapon system that Ukraine is receiving at the moment in any numbers are the F-16s, which are being supplied by the Netherlands. Perhaps those F-16s will at some point be equipped with JASSMs cruise missiles by the United States, if those reports that a decision to supply JASSMs to Ukraine are true. But so far, when the Ukrainians have sought to fly F-16s, the result has not been good. And there are reports, never confirmed, that the Russians have successfully destroyed F-16s on the ground. Anyway, there we are. That's the diplomatic situation. Zelensky, as I understand it, is now back in Kiev. I understand that his European tour has ended, though I might be wrong about that. But anyway, one way or the other, his diplomatic activity over the last couple of weeks, his visit to the United States, his meeting with Biden, his attempts to get the Ramstein meeting, which was supposed to happen on the 12th of October, to endorse his victory plan and to give the green light for missile strikes into Russia and to accelerate Ukraine's entry into NATO. That victory plan is going nowhere. There's lots of criticism of it, in the American media especially. So he's failed on that front. He's failed in his attempts to get more weapons and more funding from the Europeans specifically. The Europeans have not been able to sort out the G7 has not been able to sort out the $50 billion loan, which was going to be repaid from the interest of the frozen Russian assets. Ursula von der Leyen has floated an alternative, a $35 billion euro loan provided by the Europeans without the involvement of the United States and of the other non-EU Western countries. That plan, as I predicted in a couple of videos ago, is now also apparently in trouble. She went to Kiev and apparently assured the Ukrainians that this 35 billion euro loan, $40 billion loan, was basically money in the bank. It was definitely heading Ukraine's way. All sorts of objections have now been floated by all sorts of people across Europe. I pointed out that despite attempts to argue otherwise, almost certainly EU parliaments, national parliaments, would insist on their right to debate this loan. For the moment, nothing like that has happened, and I get the sense that some European governments at least are balking at that idea. And of course, we have the usual culprit whenever the Europeans run into problems of this kind. The Hungarians are being blamed for slowing everything down. Viktor Orbán is supposedly single-handedly preventing this loan being agreed. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that Zelensky has returned from all of his recent diplomatic activity, his diplomatic activity of the last couple of weeks, and he's come back to Kiev empty-handed. There's been no Ramstein meeting, no peace summit in November, no authorization of deep missile strikes against Russia, no accelerated NATO entry, no accelerated EU entry, no more weapon systems in any significant quantity, no more, no loans from the West, despite the deep economic crisis that Ukraine is facing. The winter is now just over the horizon. The weather is getting colder. Yesterday, as I said, the Russians carried out another missile and drone strike on Ukraine's energy system. There is, by the way, remarkably little information about this. I said in my program yesterday that I would wait until today before I provided an assessment, a general assessment of what had happened. The Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, has reported that this combined missile and drone strike on the energy system took place. These have now become so routine that the Ukrainians no longer bother to discuss them in any detail. They don't talk about the numbers of missiles that they claim that they've shot down. The various bloggers and reporting sites busy on each side of the war have basically ignored this latest drone and missile strike as if it was, a routine event that really is all but inconsequential. It's such a contrast from what used to take place before. But anyway, the fact is, the missile and drone strike did take place. The energy system across Ukraine is in deep crisis. Rolling blackouts are widely predicted across Ukraine now. There's growing social tensions as Ukraine tries to step up mobilization across a restive and increasingly disaffected and in some places very angry population. Nothing is looking up for the Ukrainians at the present time. And Bild Zeitung has now published yet another article which says that the German Defense Ministry has assessed the obvious, which is that Ukraine is incapable of conducting another offensive in any realistic time frame. That the state of the Ukrainian military is so weak, it's so fragile, it is so short of reserves that a further offensive against the Russian army is now impossible. The 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian army, the people who fought and defended Novomikhailovka and Konstantinovka in the Marinka Ugleda direction, were now fighting in the village of Katerinovka, still in the Ugleda direction, and who are apparently in the process of being pushed out by the Russians from Maximilianovka. Anyway, the 79th Brigade is now spreading stories that Zelensky, having despaired of an offensive against the Russians, is now once again thinking about an offensive against Transnistria, the region in Moldova which insists on preserving an independent, autonomous identity within Moldova itself. Moldova is due to have what appear to be tense and fraught presidential elections. The Moldovan president, Maria Sandu, is trying to get re-elected. She is facing strong opposition in Moldova itself. Maria Sandu is a strong supporter of the West, of the EU. She has been trying to chart a course to take Moldova into the EU and ultimately into NATO itself. This is widely opposed by many people in Moldova, and it is, of course, fiercely opposed in Transnistria, where there is a small Russian force, said to number around 1,000 men, which acts as a peacekeeping contingent, apparently authorized to do so by a UN Security Council resolution dating back to the 1990s. Anyway, there's been at various times reports that the Ukrainian army, presumably in cooperation with Maria Sandu's government, was going to march into Transnistria and defeat this small Russian peacekeeping force there and occupy this territory, and that the Ukrainians were going to do this in order presumably to humiliate and embarrass the Russians in some way. Though how that would assist Ukraine in terms of its own conduct of the war has never been explained. But anyway, there have been reports about this dating all the way back to 2022. Maria Sandu, in fairness, has never shown much enthusiasm for this idea. And the United States, the Pentagon, has consistently opposed it, at least up to now, because of its concerns that a Ukrainian incursion into Moldova, even one that was supported by the Moldovan government, would expand the war, and the United States does not want to see the war expanded beyond the territory of Ukraine, and they worry that if the Ukrainians do move in to Transnistria, then at some point, once places like Nikolaev and Odessa have fallen under Russian control, the Russians will follow them there, which would, of course, in effect, be the end of any attempt to draw Moldova into the Western camp. So, desperate Zelensky, unable to conduct offensives against the Russians, according to the 79th Brigade, now once again thinking about this offensive, this latest offensive, a push towards Transnistria, towards Moldova. Now, whether this is true or not, I have absolutely no idea. I would have thought that Maria Sandu specifically would certainly not want something like that to happen whilst an election was underway, an election which apparently she still has some hope of winning, though, as I said, the opposition to her is extremely strong. But anyway, one way or the other, these reports are floating around, and that they appear to come from the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. As I said, whether they're true or not is something I myself am not able to say. Anyway, whilst Zelensky may, or perhaps he's not, thinking about these plans for offensives in the direction of Transnistria, all the reports now combine to say that the offensive he launched against Russia in August of this year, the offensive in Kursk region, is now completely falling apart. The Russians renewed their offensive yesterday. Apparently they captured more territory. There are reports that they have indeed entered the village of Novoivanovka, which is located to the east of Lyubimivka. Remember that the Russians are advancing from the west. They appear to have advanced further beyond the Snagust River, or this is all advances from the west. They are coming very close now to Malaya Loknia, this fiercely contested village, and the reports that they have surrounded the village of Plechovo, south of Suja, apparently are true, and there are reports that they are now actually entered Plechovo and that fighting is going on inside this village. Meanwhile, there are also reports that further to the west, in the Glushkovo area of Kursk region, that the Russians have counterattacked, that they've pushed the Ukrainians back, that they've recovered 95% of the territory in the Glushkovo area of Kursk that the Ukrainians formerly occupied during their ill-starred counteroffensive towards Glushkovo, and anyway that everything there is going wrong, and that it's the Russians who are advancing in Glushkovo as well, with strong prospects that the Ukrainians before long will be pushed beyond the Russian border, that they will be pushed back into Ukrainian territory again. So lots of reports about this, and by the way, there's been a tweet about this. I mentioned this yesterday. This is what Julian Röpke, German reporter for Bild Zeitung. Anyway, this is what he has written about the state of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk. Let me repeat again. He is a passionate supporter of Ukraine. He's also an insightful commentator. And by the way, and in fairness, it's worth adding that he has been a skeptic about the Kursk counteroffensive from the outset. Anyway, he's written this: the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kursk did not reach the Sime River, did not reach Glushkovo, did not reach Tyotkino, did not reach Korenovo, and of course did not reach the Kursk nuclear power plant. Spatially speaking, the offensive reached none of its goals after the initial capture of Suja. That is what Julian Röpke says, and I completely agree. In fact, I've been saying this from the outset. I said way back in August that the objective clearly was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. When that didn't happen, notice that Julian Röpke effectively confirms this in this tweet. When that failed to happen, I said that the Ukrainians, the right, intelligent, proper thing for the Ukrainians to do was to withdraw completely from Kursk. If they'd done that in mid-August, after they'd conducted their raid into Kursk, they didn't need to say that they were seeking to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. They could have spun a story that it was all a raid, all intended to show to the Russians that Ukraine is able to take the fight onto Russian territory. The Western media and the Ukrainian media would have gone along with all of that, and the Ukrainians could have pulled back, withdrawn from Kursk region, kept the bulk of their forces intact. The Russians would have faced a significant amount of embarrassment. There would have been a great deal of heart-searching and recriminations about the whole event in Moscow. And whilst nothing actually would have been achieved, Ukraine would at least have gained a PR win. Now, in Kursk, everything is falling apart. The Russians are on the move. They've pushed the Ukrainians out of Glushkovo region. They're now gradually surrounding Suja itself. They're capturing all the villages around Suja. They're apparently sending drones, fleets of drones flying over Suja around the clock, which attack Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian troops and armored vehicles in Suja itself. There is sporadic shelling and bombing of Suja. The Russians are in the process of capturing Plekhovo, south of Suja, threatening the main roads that lead to Suja itself. And of course, the rains are coming in a few weeks' time, which will make movement within the pocket, within the Kursk pocket, all but impossible, given that the Russians have complete fire control over all of the roads in the pocket. Those roads not being particularly good roads anyway. And to cap everything, we have those reports that there's 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops cut off. One apparently the Olgovka area, another supposedly in the Lyubimovka area, where fighting is still underway. So it's now shaping rapidly into a disaster. And, well, there are some reports. I noticed that the Military Summary channel is now claiming that the Ukrainians are starting quietly to pull forces through Suja out of the Kursk pocket entirely, that they're retreating back into Ukraine, into Sumy region. I have to say, I've not seen a single other report anywhere that says this, that there is a decision by the Ukrainians to pull out of Kursk. If it happens, there will be enormous recriminations about the Kursk operation, the Kursk offensive in Ukraine. I believe total losses that the Ukrainians have suffered in Kursk region, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, are now well in excess of 20,000. This is, of course, men both killed and wounded, and apparently the Russians are now also taking a significant amount of Ukrainians prisoner in the Kursk region, though it's impossible to give an exact number. But anyway, the whole thing is going to look like a debacle, and there might be political repercussions. There will be criticisms of Zelensky. There will probably be criticisms of Syrskyi. Syrskyi has at various times tried to give the impression that the Kursk operation was not his idea, but he did, after all, carry it out, and he did at various times, including most recently, in statements that he made around 48 hours ago. He did give the impression of having ownership of it. There is a view that Zelensky's government will not survive a Ukrainian collapse in Kursk, that the event is too identified with Zelensky himself, that his reputation is too attached to what happens in Kursk to survive a clear-cut defeat there, an encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Kursk, which is a real possibility, or perhaps an ignominious and humiliating retreat after heavy losses. Well, I don't know. Zelensky's government has often looked fragile, but real opposition to him has never really amounted to very much in Ukraine. And I repeat again, so long as he has the backing of the Western powers, of the Americans above all, I would have thought he was safe. But anyway, those views, do exist, that a collapse in Kursk will be the end of Zelensky, and that he will then face opposition and pressure inside Ukraine to an extent that he'll be forced to step down. We shall see. Anyway, that's Kursk region. Everything is going wrong there. Everything's going wrong pretty much everywhere else as well. This morning, there was reports that the Russians, in fact, they don't seem to be reports, they seem to be conclusive proof that the Russians have captured another important village in the Vremivka salient area in Zaporozhye region, or rather in southern Donbass, even as the Russians gradually edge forward towards the village of Velika Novosilka in southern Donbass. The next objective of the Russians in southern Donbass, or at least in parts of southern Donbass, since the fall of Ugledar. Well, anyway, those reports exist. To what extent they're true, I'm not going to speculate, but anyway, that's the Russians do seem to have made a successful advance in that direction. And, well, there's also reports about more Russian attacks towards Bogoyavlenka. There's apparently intense fighting going on for various fortified positions immediately to the south of this village, north of Ugledar. It does appear to be a major Russian objective. And there are reports of a large-scale surrender of Ukrainian troops in the village of Katerinovka, or south of the village of Katerinovka, also in the Ugledar area, in the area, to be precise, west of Konstantinovka, and north of Odyane, which the Russians captured some days ago. I should say that again, this is where I reveal my own lack of understanding. I don't fully understand why the Russians feel they need to capture these villages, Katerinovka, Yelizavetka, Antonovka, and the others, Ilinka and the others. Presumably there is some purpose to this effect. Well, there obviously is some purpose to this offensive. I haven't seen anybody explain it up to now. I would have thought that if the Russians focused on Bogoyavlenka and captured it, and Novokrainka a little further to the west, then the Ukrainian positions in these villages would have become untenable. But presumably, the topography and something about the general landscape and the line of the fortifications and the roads makes it important for the Russians to clear these villages, and it seems that they are actually in the process of doing so. So things appear to be going badly for the Ukrainians in this part of the battlefronts as well. But the worst news continues to be from further north in the area of Kurachovo and Selidovo and areas like that. And, well, the stories that we're getting is that the Russians are now pressing hard around Selidovo. The Russians' defense ministry this morning announced the capture of the village of Mikhailivka. This is the village immediately to the east of Selidovo. This is a village with a coal mine and a slag heap, which the Russians captured. In fact, the Russians almost certainly captured Mikhailivka. Some weeks back, it's probably taken the Russians, however, some time to consolidate fully their control of this village. The fact that the Russian Defense Ministry has now said that Mikhailivka is under Russian control probably means that the Russians not only control Mikhailovka itself, but that they have pressed in further in the eastern part of Selidovo. And, well, there is a lot of argument and discussion about whether the Russians control the big coal mine and slag heap at the northeastern end of Selidovo. The military summary channel there appears to think that they probably don't, and that the Ukrainians still are in control, at least of the slag heap. There does seem to be fighting going on the coal mine and the slag heap. As I said many times, I am not there, so I can't say. But I would have thought that if the Russians don't control this coal mine and slag heap, now that they've announced that Mikhailovka is under their control, almost certainly they will control it fairly soon. And I discussed how the Russians their pincers seem to be closing around Selidovka, that they're moving towards the villages of Vishneve, the village of Vishneve to the west of Selidovo. They're strongly located to the north and south of Selidovo, and also now that they confirmed to control Mikhailovka, that they're also strongly positioned to the east of Selidovo as well. And, well, there's been lots of reports that the Ukrainians are thinking of pulling out of Selidovo, and that the Ukrainian command is refusing this. But, of course, the other big story in this area is about the fighting around the various villages in the Kurakovo area. As I've said, the Russians clearly in control of Ostrivske, which is located close to Kurakovo itself. Almost certainly the Russians soon will have control of the village of Maximilianovka. And anyway, there is apparently heavy fighting going on for Novoselidivka and Izmailovka, or at least for parts of these two villages. As I said, it looks as if the earlier reports that the Russians had captured the eastern part of Novoselidivka and the western part of Izmailovka probably referred to movements of Russian scouting parties in these places, but it looks as if there is now a major assault underway and bitter fighting, and that the Ukrainians are trying to defend as fiercely as they can, but it's only a matter of time, it seems to me, before the Russians do finally capture these villages. Meanwhile, over the course of recent programs, I've discussed how the Russians now appear to have complete control with drones over all of the roads to the west of the cauldron around the four villages of Vovchenka, Kurakovka, Alexandropil, and Zoryanie, and also the village, or rather the small town of Girnik. And that I suspect that a lot of the activity with these drones is actually of the so-called, well, I've been referring it as the Orion drone, the equivalent of the Predator and Reaper drones that the Russian military use. Though I'm told that I'm actually wrong, that the drone that the Russians are using is a much bigger drone than the Orion. It's apparently called the Inohodets, or apparently there is an alternative name for it, which is the Sirius drone. It's a much bigger drone. It is closer, in other words, much closer in scale to the Reaper and the Predator than the much smaller Orion. And it's able to loiter over territory, and it can carry all kinds of bombs. reports say that it could carry bombs that weigh up to 100 kilos or even 500 kilos. Just saying. And anyway, one way or the other, these drones appear to be very active in this area, attacking Ukrainian defensive, attacking Ukrainian vehicles that move along these roads. Now, a number of people have pointed out that, in fact, the vehicles in question, and as I said, one only sees isolated vehicles now moving along deserted roads, otherwise deserted roads, and they're not moving from west to east, which would presumably be the case if the Ukrainians were trying to send reinforcements or supplies to the Ukrainians cut off in these villages. But on the contrary, they seem to be moving along the roads from east to west. In other words, they seem to be trying to escape this cauldron. We're talking about isolated vehicles trying to move along the roads one at a time and picked off by the Russians as they do. And to my mind, that's the strongest evidence there is that we do indeed have a cauldron in this area, that the Ukrainians are indeed, apparently, possibly without proper orders, trying to escape encirclement along roads which the Russians are able to patrol continuously with their drones. Anyway, that's the reports that we're getting from there. There are lots of reports about the situation around Pokrovsk itself. The situation again around Pokrovsk appears to be very difficult for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians themselves are now have now confirmed that the Russian troops have indeed entered the village of Promin, which lies to the north of the village of Mykolaievka. It is, by the way, located just north of the road from Grodivka to Mirnograd. Grodivka was the last important village on the road itself, before Mirnograd. Promin lies immediately to the north of it. It looks to me as if what's happened is that with Mikhailovka having fallen under Russian control, the Russians have driven up the road and are now trying to clear Promin itself, driven up the road from Grodivka, I should make clear, that they've driven up this road, that they're attacking this village, and presumably they will then try to clear the next village to the north, which is a village called Moskovsky. And these are all villages that lie to the west of Mirnograd. The Russians are already located very close to Mirnograd, apparently about a kilometer south of Mirnograd along the railway lines, and they already control the village of Mikhailovka, a little to the south, and they're also apparently, well, in fact, there's no doubt about it, that they're also attacking the villages of Sukhe Yar and Lisivka, which lie a little further to the south in this same area. And they're also clearing all the fortified lines in this area too. Now, there's a whole string of villages to the west of Mirnograd, Novoekonomichke, Mirolyubivka, Yelizavetka, Vozvizhenka, Vodyane Druche, Malinivka, which the Russians have not so far attacked and sought to capture. They all lie, by the way, along the main road from Pokrovsk and Mirnograd to the east to Toretsk and Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. I had expected back in the summer that the Russians would focus on capturing these villages before they moved on Pakrovsk, but instead they moved in a different direction. They moved in a southerly direction rather than seeking to capture this road itself. I wonder whether the attack on Promin and Moskovsky doesn't suggest that the Russians do intend to storm these villages along this main supply road before the main battle for Mirnograd and Pakrovsk begins, in which case it could be that it will be delayed to later in the autumn. Just saying. Anyway, one way or the other, a big battle is underway. The military summary channel has pointed out that there is another major coal mine, the Dimitrov mine. Of course, Mirnograd used to be called Dimitrov after Georgy Dimitrov, the famous Bulgarian communist and the first leader of communist Bulgaria just after the Second World War. Anyway, there's reports that there appears to be another big coal mine and slag heap located just in the southwestern area of Mirnograd. It could be that the Russians will want to capture that coal mine and slag heap when they do finally start their operation against Mirnograd. And supposedly the slag heap towers over Pakrovsk itself, and control of it will make Pakrovsk effectively undefendable. Well, that's the report we're hearing. Now, anyway, that's the situation in this, the most important, most complicated area of the battlefront. A huge battle playing out in southwestern Donbass. I think the decisive battle of the war. Meanwhile, the Russians, and by the way, some Ukrainian sources, are now claiming that the Ukrainians are withdrawing from Toretsk. And this has been stated on TASS, on the TASS news agency. It's been communicated by TASS by sources in what TASS refers to as the security forces. Which security forces? Anyway, we're not told. Anyway, the report says, and this is a direct quote from the sources within these security forces, the quote is, the situation for the enemy in Toretsk, the Russians call it Dzerzhinsk, is quite deplorable. They are forced to flee again. Now there is a partial withdrawal of units from the city. Ukrainian military is acting in accordance with the known practice of withdrawing troops in small groups. So that implies that a general withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Toretsk is now underway. There are similar reports to this effect from Ukrainian sources as well. I think this is all very sketchy and unclear, but it could be the case. But one way or the other, Zelensky is short of men. His mobilization efforts are encountering immense resistance within Ukrainian society. He's short of equipment. His Kursk offensive is turning into a disaster, and in the West, the doors have been slammed in his face. Surely the moment has come for the Ukrainians to acknowledge that the war, publicly acknowledge that the war is lost, and to see whether they can begin negotiations, which can only happen on the terms that Putin outlined in his address to the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry, on the 14th of June. If Zelensky cannot do that, and I don't see how he can, the only responsible and proper thing for him to do is to stand down. After all, everything he has tried has visibly failed, and his latest diplomatic expedition in the West was a complete failure. I don't expect him to do it. He's going to cling on. He'll cling on as long as he can, and the risk is that he'll bring down Ukraine with him. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.